Daniel Reyes hadn't planned on becoming the kind of man who waited outside expensive restaurants at 10:30 at night, watching through tinted windows while pretending he wasn't worried. But life had rewritten his plans years ago, the day his wife passed away and left him alone with a 3-year-old daughter and a heart that had forgotten how to hope. And ever since then, everything he did revolved around survival, responsibility, and making sure little Sophia never felt the weight of what they'd lost. Working as the executive driver and personal assistant to his company's CEO, Olivia Harrington, had never been part of his dream either. Yet somehow it had become the one steady thing keeping their world from collapsing, because Olivia paid well, treated him with a level of respect most billionaires didn't bother with, and most importantly, she trusted him, though Daniel never mistook kindness for closeness. She was still the CEO of Harrington Global Enterprises, a woman who commanded boardrooms, negotiated billion-dollar mergers, and appeared on magazine covers with headlines calling her the Ice Queen of Wall Street. A nickname Daniel secretly despised because behind that composed exterior he'd seen glimpses of something softer, something tired, something lonely. Tonight, however, something felt off, because when Olivia had stepped out of the car earlier in a midnight blue dress that shimmered under the city lights, she hadn't looked powerful. She had looked uncertain, almost hesitant, and Daniel had caught the flicker in her eyes when she told him, "It's just dinner, Daniel. You don't need to wait." But he had nodded and said, "I'll be nearby, ma'am." Anyway, because instinct told him she might need him, and instincts had never failed him before. Not in fatherhood, not in grief, and certainly not when it came to protecting people he cared about. Inside the restaurant, Olivia sat across from Marcus Whitmore, a venture capitalist with a smile too sharp to be sincere and a reputation Daniel had heard whispered about in staff corridors. A man who collected successful women the way others collected luxury watches, wearing them proudly before discarding them for newer models. And Daniel didn't trust him from the moment he'd opened Olivia's car door, and Marcus had looked at him like he was invisible, like he was part of the upholstery. Time crawled by, Daniel's fingers tightening around the steering wheel as he replayed Olivia's slight tremor earlier when she checked her reflection in the side mirror. And then it happened. He saw her through the glass shift. In her seat, her posture stiffening, Marcus leaning too far across the table, his hand reaching for hers in a way that didn't look invited, and even from outside Daniel could sense the discomfort in her forced smile, the polite nods that masked unease, and something inside him snapped not out of jealousy but out of instinctive protection, the same instinct that made him wake up at the slightest sound from Sophia's bedroom. When Olivia's phone buzzed and she glanced down at the screen, Daniel realized it was the silent alert he had programmed into her device months ago, just in case. And without thinking twice, he stepped out of the car, straightened his jacket, and walked into the restaurant with calm authority, his expression controlled but his jaw set in quiet resolve. He approached their table with a respectful nod and said, "Ma'am, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's an urgent matter requiring your attention." And the relief that flooded Olivia's eyes in that instant was unmistakable, raw, and so unguarded it stole Daniel's breath, because that look wasn't just gratitude. It was trust, deep and unquestioning, and Marcus frowned, irritation flashing across his face. But Olivia stood immediately, smoothing her dress as she said, "Excuse me, Marcus. Duty calls." Her voice steady again, CO composure restored. Yet when they reached the safety of the car and the doors shut, the silence between them was heavy until suddenly Olivia let out a shaky laugh that dissolved into a fragile whisper, "Thank you." And Daniel kept his gaze forward, giving her privacy even in the darkness. "You don't have to thank me, ma'am," he replied gently. "It's my job." But she looked at him then in a way she never had before, studying him as if seeing more than just an employee, as if measuring something deeper, something she had been carrying alone for far too long. The drive back was quiet except for the hum of the engine and the distant city noise, and Daniel assumed the night would end there. Another crisis handled, another line of professionalism maintained. But when they pulled up outside her penthouse, Olivia hesitated before opening the door and said softly, "Daniel, do you ever regret choosing responsibility over happiness?" The question caught him off guard because it wasn't about Marcus, it wasn't about business, it was about something personal, something vulnerable, and he thought of Sophia's sleepy hugs, of unpaid bills, of dreams postponed indefinitely, and he answered honestly, "I don't think they're always separate things." And Olivia's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say more, but instead she nodded and stepped out, disappearing into the elevator with a look he couldn't quite decipher. What Daniel didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that upstairs in her quiet apartment, Olivia stood by the window watching his car drive away and pressed a hand to her chest because the man who had just rescued her from humiliation was the same man she had been silently loving for nearly 3 years, loving in stolen glances during meetings, loving in the way he spoke about his daughter with fierce tenderness, loving in the way he never once tried to use proximity to power for personal gain, loving in silence. Because CEOs didn't fall for their employees and single fathers didn't have time for complicated emotions, and yet the heart rarely obeyed logic. Back in his modest apartment, Daniel tucked Sophia into bed and listened to her chatter about school projects, unaware that the most powerful woman in his world was lying awake thinking about him, replaying the moment he walked into that restaurant like a knight disguised in a driver's uniform. And as the city lights flickered outside both their windows, something invisible had shifted between them, something neither of them could undo. And if you're already feeling that shift, if you can sense the storm of emotions building beneath their quiet restraint, make sure you subscribe to this channel because this is only the beginning of a love that has been waiting in silence far too long. The morning after the disastrous dinner felt deceptively ordinary. The kind of quiet sunrise that gave no warning that lives were about to change forever, and Daniel Reyes moved through his routine with the same steady discipline that had defined him for years. Waking before dawn, preparing Sophia's breakfast, braiding her hair with clumsy but improving fingers, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead before walking her to the bus stop. Yet beneath his calm exterior something lingered from the night before, something he refused to name, because naming it would mean crossing a line he had drawn in permanent ink the day he signed his employment contract with Harrington Global Enterprises. Meanwhile, high above the city in her glass-walled penthouse, Olivia Harrington stood barefoot with a cup of untouched coffee growing cold in her hand, staring at the skyline but seeing only one face, one quiet act of loyalty replaying in relentless detail, and for the first time in years the powerful CEO who had negotiated hostile takeovers without blinking found herself terrified. Not of investors, not of competitors, but of her own heart. At precisely 8:30 Daniel arrived at the underground garage as usual, stepping out of his car in a crisp black suit, unaware that Olivia had already been watching the security feed from her office upstairs, her breath catching slightly at the sight of him adjusting his cufflinks before heading toward the elevator. And when he entered her office, moments later he offered the same respectful nod, the same professional tone. "Good morning, Ms. Harrington." Yet something in the air felt different, charged, fragile, as if both of them were balancing on the edge of an unspoken truth. Olivia dismissed her assistant for the morning, an unusual move, and Daniel noticed but said nothing, because noticing too much had never served him well. And then she did something even more unexpected. She closed the glass blinds, sealing them inside a private world away from the hum of the corporate floor, and turned to face him not as a CEO but as a woman wrestling with courage. "Daniel," she began, her voice steady but softer than he had ever heard it. "Last night wasn't the first time you've stepped in for me." And he shifted slightly, unsure where this was going, replying carefully, "You hired me to ensure your safety, ma'am." But she shook her head slowly, stepping closer, the distance between them narrowing in a way that made his pulse quicken despite every rule screaming inside him. "I hired you because you were the only one who looked at me during that interview without seeing my last name first," she said quietly, and the confession hung between them like a fragile thread. Daniel remembered that interview vividly. How he had been desperate for stable work after months of financial strain. How he had refused to exaggerate his credentials. How she had asked him one unexpected question. "What matters most to you?" And he had answered without hesitation, "My daughter." And something in her expression then had shifted just as it was shifting now. "I need to tell you something," Olivia continued, her composure wavering for the first time since he'd known her. "And I understand if it changes everything." And Daniel's instincts told him to stop this conversation before it began, to protect both of them from consequences that could ripple through careers and reputations. But he couldn't move, couldn't speak, because part of him needed to hear whatever she was about to say. "I have been in love with you for 3 years, she said, the words escaping like a breath she had held for far too long, and silence exploded in the room, thick and disorienting, Daniel's mind struggling to process what he had just heard. Because love wasn't something he allowed himself to imagine. Not with a boss. Not with a woman whose world was built of skyscrapers and stock markets while his revolved around bedtime stories and grocery budgets, and yet as he searched her face for any hint of doubt, he found only vulnerability, no CEO armor, no corporate calculation, just a woman risking rejection. "You don't have to say anything," she added quickly, misreading his stunned expression as discomfort. "I just couldn't keep pretending that last night didn't mean more than it did." And he finally found his voice, low and conflicted. "Olivia, this could cost you everything." Because he knew how quickly gossip spread in executive circles, how shareholders scrutinized every decision, how a relationship with an employee could spark scandal. But she stepped even closer, her eyes shining not with recklessness but with certainty. "Then let it cost me," she whispered, "because living without telling you has already cost me enough." And something inside Daniel cracked, not because of ambition or fantasy, but because he saw in her the same loneliness he carried, the same quiet nights after Sophia slept when the apartment felt too silent, the same hunger for partnership buried under responsibility. He thought of every moment she had lingered. During conversations about his daughter, every subtle smile when he spoke passionately about integrity, every time she had defended him in board meetings when executives questioned why a CEO needed such a devoted driver. And suddenly the past 3 years rearranged themselves into a pattern he had been blind to. "Why me?" he asked honestly, and her answer was immediate, unwavering. "Because you never tried to impress me. Because you choose kindness when no one is watching. Because when you walked into that restaurant last night, you didn't look at me like I was weak. You looked at me like I was worth protecting." And that was the moment his carefully constructed walls began to crumble, because he had spent so long being strong for everyone else that he had forgotten what it felt like to be chosen. Not for status, not for convenience, but for who he was. Still, fear lingered, practical and sharp. "And Sophia?" he asked, because his daughter was the axis of his universe, and Olivia's expression softened further. "I would never ask you to choose," she said gently. "I would only hope to earn a place in her world." And the sincerity in her voice dissolved the final barrier. Daniel took a slow breath, stepping forward until there was no space left between them, and for a suspended heartbeat neither of them moved, the magnitude of what they were risking echoing in the quiet office, before he reached up and brushed a strand of hair from her face with trembling fingers, not as an employee but as a man allowing himself to feel. "I was afraid," he admitted softly, "because wanting you felt impossible." And her answering smile was radiant, unguarded, and when their foreheads touched it wasn't a dramatic collision of passion but a quiet merging of two tired hearts finally exhaling. Outside the closed blinds the corporate world continued unaware, but inside that office a decision had been made. Not recklessly, not impulsively, but bravely. Weeks later the announcement of their relationship sent shockwaves through the company. Whispers filling hallways, investors raising brows, Yet Olivia faced every question with calm authority, making it clear that professionalism would remain uncompromised, and Daniel, refusing special treatment, chose to transition into a new role within the company's security division to eliminate conflicts of interest, a move that earned reluctant respect even from skeptics. At home, Sophia studied Olivia carefully the first evening they met, tiny arms crossed in adorable suspicion before eventually declaring, "You make Daddy smile," and granting her approval with a solemn nod that made them both laugh through tears. Love did not dismantle their responsibilities. It strengthened them, turning quiet endurance into shared resilience, and the night Daniel once spent waiting outside a restaurant became the story they would someday tell about how courage begins in small acts of protection. So if this story moved you, if you believe that silent love deserves a voice and second chances are worth the risk, make sure you subscribe to this channel and stay with us for more powerful stories about strength, sacrifice, and the kind of love that waits patiently in the shadows until the right moment to shine.